Hello everyone. Today's video is going to look into the Great Depression and the New Deal, first focusing in on migration, and then we'll look into key programs of the first New Deal. So let's dive right into it. If you are reading along with these lectures, here are the page numbers from Volume 2 of American Yacht. Here are the key terms we'll discuss, and I will also leave a link in the description as well as the cards if you want the online version of that textbook. So here are the guiding questions for the day. Again, we want to look into migration and immigration patterns, and then we'll also look at some of those early New Deal programs and think about the ways in which the American public might start to see the government's response to the Great Depression a little bit differently. So let's first dive into some local history for us in Los Angeles. This is a really important chapter that I don't think gets a lot of attention in most history textbooks. So what was Mexican repatriation, and what literally does repatriation mean? As far as context is concerned, this dates back to the 1920s for a few reasons. So for one, in the 1920 census, the United States classified Mexican as a separate race. Prior to that, anyone of Mexican descent was considered white. So that change is very interesting because in the 1920s, we also see a string of immigration laws that are restricting immigration from certain parts of the world, including Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia and Africa. So you might think, oh, well, is the United States government also going to restrict immigration from countries in Latin America? Well, ultimately, they do not do that. What's interesting is that in the 1920s, when the economy was doing well, there was a high demand for labor. And so there was a very free-flowing migration pattern from Mexico into the United States. But that's going to change in the Great Depression because unemployment is so high. And one of the things that occurs in the late 1920s during the Hoover administration is this attempt to alleviate unemployment. And that's ultimately what repatriation was attempting to do. Repatriation, what it literally means is returning, right? Returning to one's homeland. But the problem with using this word is that about 60% of the people that were so-called repatriated were actually US citizens. So let me rewind a little bit. What this did, and some were volunteers, this ultimately was this mass relocation of between 400,000 and 2 million people of Mexican descent to Mexico. And again, as I just said, about 60% were US citizens. And why are these number ranges so huge, you might ask? That's because there were not very accurate records kept about this process. And the Los Angeles area was hit the hardest. I have some primary sources that I showed you in class that might be really useful. So I'll try to round up some of those and link them in the description if you want to learn more. What's also really interesting is that there was no public apology for this repatriation program, and many people who were deported under this program never returned. And that apology, it's worth mentioning that that came from the state of California. There has never been a federal government apology for this program. So I will definitely provide you with some resources to learn more about that if I can't find those specific primary documents. Let's move on to the first New Deal. And the key question we want to ask here is, how does FDR's administration respond to the Great Depression, and how is that different from Hoover's response? So he was elected by what very much looks like a landslide. Of course, the popular vote was a little closer, but still, he had a clear mandate. And so what he does is he spends his first 100 days in office attempting to draft real legislation, make real change, and also try to restore Americans' faith in the government to actually take responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. So when he spoke in his inaugural address, one of the most famous quotes that came from that was, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And that makes me think of this emphasis I always place on the idea that the Great Depression was actually more of a disease, in the sense that it was fueled and it lasted so long because of anxiety and fear. People were too afraid to put their money back in the bank and many other things, right? Businesses were afraid of taking too drastic of a measure to reopen and provide more jobs. They didn't feel stable either. And so, in any event, in this first 100 days, the first thing that happens is that FDR calls Congress into an emergency session. And the goal is to revive industry and agriculture while also drafting more permanent change to provide relief and to make reform so this never happens again. One of the key things that takes place here at the beginning was a 4-day bank holiday. And it was a holiday because these banks actually closed for these 4 days. And in the meantime, FDR and Congress drafted the Emergency Banking Act. And ultimately, what that led to was a reopening of banks that were solvent and stable, and then aid to banks that were not. So he also started to speak to the American people on a very regular basis, and those were called fireside chats. And so you see in this image on the right, he got on the radio, and many major national news networks would record it and broadcast it. And he would inform the public of the steps that he and Congress had taken that day. And the goal and result of these fireside chats was a strengthening of morale and also the idea that FDR could help. Because remember, at the beginning of the Great Depression, many American citizens had lost faith in Herbert Hoover's attempts to try to alleviate some of the most drastic symptoms of the Great Depression. And within about 2 weeks, people started returning cash to the bank that they had at that point been hoarding. And so that does start to lead to some recovery, although very slowly. So key New Deal programs, I'm not going to talk about an entire exhaustive list here, but the Glass-Steagall Act, this is really important. It was passed in 1933. It does two things. So first, it placed limits on the ability of commercial banks to speculate on the stock market. And it also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, also known as the FDIC. And what that did also is it took the United States off of the gold standard. It introduced almost $1 billion worth of government-owned gold to be used for loaning purposes. And that was just broadly part of the Glass-Steagall Act. But to zoom in more on the FDIC, that ensured savings of bank depositors, and it monitored the soundness of insured banking institutions, and it helped protect depositors from risky commercial bank investments. It helped restore consumer confidence in the banking system. And the Glass-Steagall Act lasted, at least the portion that separated commercial banks from investing on the stock market, that lasted until 1999. And that part of it was repealed during Bill Clinton's second term. And so what that means is there's no longer a distinction between commercial and investment banks. And so they're less regulated. And some economists say that it facilitated or worsened the 2000 to 2009 Great Recession. The FDIC, however, still exists to this day. Another key program is the Civilian Conservation Corps, that's known as the CCC. You might notice, by the way, that most of these programs have some sort of acronym associated with them. These are nicknamed the alphabet soup programs. And so often when you have to memorize a whole list of them, you refer to them by their acronyms. It's much, much easier to remember. Good study tool right there. So in any event, back to the CCC, it provided jobs and relocation for young men between the ages of 18 to 25, typically, in rural settings. And it was under the direction of the U.S. military. And CCC workers typically were responsible for building public parks, blazing trails in forests, in national parks, planting trees, building dams, and of course those dams help with flood control. And any kind of land that might have been ruined by something like a forest fire, they would help reclaim that. They would drain swamps, and just generally they would help with conservation efforts. And again, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created in 1933 during the first New Deal. It was designed to help unemployed youth, hence the low age range there. And these jobs were almost always temporary. And they did provide aid to families. Oftentimes, the young men who worked in CCC programs would mail much of their check back home to help with their families. And this lasted until 1942. And the CCC, while it provided jobs for millions of men, there was a massive failure in terms of its commitment to diversity and inclusion. So Black Americans, for example, were excluded from working in the CCC in some states. And the states would try to justify that by saying that they were needed for cotton cultivation, because this was still an age of sharecropping and king cotton. And just to provide a little more detail, Robert Fechner, the director of the CCC, defended that kind of discriminatory action by saying that he was satisfied, and he said, quote, that Black employees, quote, prefer to be in companies composed exclusively of their own race. And he said this was to prove that their racially motivated segregation was not on a discriminatory basis. So interesting that he's justifying it sort of by saying, well, this is what Black workers want, right? Regardless of truth in that statement. The Public Works Administration, aka the PWA, what that did was it provided loans to state and local governments to build public works such as dams, ports, bridges, sewage plants, government buildings, power plants, airports, hospitals, and other useful projects. It too was created in 1933. Again, we're still, of course, in the first 100 days, so probably stating the obvious. It was designed to provide employment and stabilize purchasing power. And it was responsible for the construction of famous landmarks such as the Lincoln Tunnel, which you see to the left, that connects Weehawken, New Jersey to Midtown Manhattan. And then to the right, you see the Hoover Dam, and it was still under construction in this photograph before the upstream portion was flooded. And the PWA was not ever declared unconstitutional, but the program did end in 1938. We'll talk about other New Deal programs that actually were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in our next video. Next example was the Tennessee Valley Authority, aka the TVA, that was created on May 18th, 1933. And first, it provided flood control and electricity generation, fertilizer manufacturing, and economic development to the Tennessee Valley. And that was a region that was hit very hard by the Great Depression. And it, of course, as we know from the economic state of rural America in the 1920s, it had already been a very poverty-stricken region. The TVA helped people who felt that private companies were charging too much for power, and it also helped widen the scope of the electricity range. Much of the rural South at this point was either under-electrified or still completely devoid of electricity. And it's still around to this day, and it's the 6th largest electricity provider in the United States. And the TVA's service area covers all of the state of Tennessee, portions of Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, and small areas of Georgia, North Carolina, and Virginia. So it's still federally owned today, but starting in the 1970s, there was an era of deregulation. And so at this point, it doesn't receive taxpayer dollars, and it essentially acts like a for-profit company. So it charges customers for power. And in addition to controlling 29 hydroelectric power plants, so essentially dams rather, not power plants, the TVA controls 5 coal-fired power plants and 3 nuclear power plants with 7 total operating reactors, 9 simple cycle natural gas combustion turbine plants, 9 combined cycle gas plants, 1 pumped storage hydroelectric plant, and I think that's it. Oh, a little bit more actually. Sorry, missed that on the bottom of my notes. Also a wind energy site, and finally 15 small solar energy sites. So I had to look at my notes. That's a lot of specifics there, but I wanted to mention that because it's obviously grown much larger, and it's also not only providing hydroelectric power. And so because of that, it has faced some scrutiny because many of these other sources of energy, of course, are responsible for lots of carbon emission. And so, what we've seen in recent years is some effort, depending on who's in Congress and who's in the White House, to resort to, or not resort to, but to try to convert to more sustainable forms of electricity. And so, we have seen the closing of some coal plants rather recently, for example, and this does remain controversial to this day. Okay, I think this is the last example, and that's the Agricultural Adjustment Act, aka the AAA, again created in 1933. And at first, it subsidized farmers not to plant not to plant too many crops, rather, and also even to kill cattle if they had too many of them. And the idea behind that was to reduce crop surplus and to just generally raise prices of agricultural goods. And to help, this was designed to help farmers so that their prices could go up and that they could, again, start making profits. Eventually, it was ruled unconstitutional because it was seen as out of the jurisdiction of the federal government. But this also is controversial in the sense that the relief typically went directly to farm owners, and since it encouraged them to produce less, often the farm owners kept the relief money to themselves, and the tenant farmers, including sharecroppers that were working on their land, were left with no place to work, and that resulted in them migrating elsewhere, often to the north, the Midwest, or the West Coast in search of work. And until the outbreak of World War II, there wasn't much work available, and so they're sort of joining the ranks of folks like the Okies fleeing the Dust Bowl, and many other people that are struck with poverty. So speaking of the Dust Bowl, let's talk a little bit more about it by considering just broad effects that the Great Depression has on the West. So the Dust Bowl was a culmination of poor farming methods, and it stripped farmland of its natural vegetation. So often, prior to the 1930s, farmers in places like the Great Plains region would not let their land lay fallow, for example, and they would plant crops that oftentimes dried out the soil. And so there was this wave of dust storms that dramatically impacted this region. And sometimes these storms were so bad that they would end up blowing all the way to the East Coast. But again, they most acutely impacted this region. And of course, because of these massive dust storms, the land was completely infertile, and it triggers a massive wave of migration out of the region, mainly west of California, in search of better harvests and job opportunities. Oklahoma alone lost over 440,000 people, and that was about 18% of the state's population at the time. And those people who left Oklahoma were known as Okies. And so oftentimes, like in this picture, you see them just getting on a car. You would see entire families driving what were called jalopies. They were really cheap cars, and they would pile as much as they could onto these cars and head west and often never return. A great book to read if you're more interested in the Dust Bowl is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which it takes place, it's about a family of Okies who were moving to California in search of a better life. But often they didn't find anything better when they arrived at their destination. They were met with other unemployed people that were looking for work as well. Government programs to help provide relief were multifold. We talked about some of them previously, the AAA and the TVA, for example. The federal government also attempted to educate farmers to plant soil-enriching crops and use more efficient methods like using fertilizer. The Soil Conservation Service was created during the first New Deal, and it was an attempt to provide assistance to farmers who were engaged in this conservation work. And what's also interesting is that there was quite a bit of racial hostility in certain parts of the country, of course, the South, but also the South and Southwest. So there was quite a bit of hostility in Texas, for example, against Mexican and Mexican Americans. And so you actually saw that due to programs like the AAA, landowners would reduce their acreage, and they would then evict their tenant farmers. And in fact, In the 1930s, many people of Mexican descent were subject to Jim Crow laws as well. And what else can I talk about with regard to the West? So we talked about the TVA already, but there were also other New Deal water projects, and these allowed for massive urban growth, agricultural expansion, and massive irrigation. As we already discussed, it provided low-cost electricity and flood control. And it did ultimately cause some farmers to become immensely wealthy at the expense of others. And it also did provide it led to general environmental decline, often because of things like these new fertilizers, that while they were effective in reducing crop yield, they were not very good for the environment. And it also had a detrimental impact on indigenous Americans. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that point, it was a bureaucratic agency of the federal government. It was headed by John Collier, and he attempted to reform harmful practices. What I mean by that, here's an example. The Indian Reorganization Act restored tribal ownership of land, but some tribes, for example, the Navajo, rejected the Indian Reorganization Act because they saw it as an effort by this bureau to reduce their livestock. And the bureau did actually grow slightly more sensitive to cultural freedom and tried to support their efforts to restore tribal rights. But still at the same time, there was also an effort to control the way in which they lived on this land. So it's complex. Ultimately, I would argue that it still was rather detrimental. Let's talk a little bit about the New Deal in the South, and then we'll wrap up this video. So poverty, as we know, was rampant in rural America even before the Great Depression. So of course, the South was no exception. What made it unique was that Black Americans were doubly plagued by the acute unemployment problems felt by the Great Depression, along with just broader consequences of Jim Crow laws. So they were kept in a perpetual state of poverty. And Southern farmers by 1929 on average earned about a quarter as much as their Western counterparts. Some New Deal programs like the AAA did have the South specifically in mind, and FDR's goal was to decrease the amount of land used for cotton cultivation. But because of the nature of sharecropping, as we said, the effect actually was not necessarily what the intent was. And other New Deal programs aimed at fighting poverty did have broader reaching effects beyond the South. So the National Recovery Act, aka the NRA, was designed to raise wages and improve working conditions and suppress the use of child labor. So because wages were so much lower in the South, the NRA was directed specifically at them. And I want to emphasize, hopefully it goes without saying, but the other NRA, the National Rifle Association, has absolutely nothing to do with this. They just happen to share the same acronym, and part of that was because the NRA eventually was struck down by the Supreme Court, the National Recovery Act, that is. More on that later. In any event, a little bit later in the New Deal, this was actually the second New Deal, but just very briefly, the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act established a federal minimum wage for the first time in U.S. history, and that started at 25 cents an hour, and it was later adjusted to 40 cents an hour. And if we were to adjust that for inflation, this is equivalent to $7.98, and that's actually above the current federal minimum wage today, which is $7.25. That's in 2022. I'm recording this in March. And that's also interesting because that is the same minimum wage that it's been since 2009. Before that, it was $5.25 an hour. The 1935 National Labor Relations Act, aka the Wagner Act, protected workers' rights to belong to unions and collectively bargain. And since anti-union sentiment was particularly strong in the Southern economy, this federal policy was a significant step towards labor reform. And that, combined with the AAA, worked to modernize the Southern economy. And we already talked about the TVA, but just to hammer it in, it was the most successful New Deal alphabet program for the South because it employed local residents to construct dams. And again, just its lasting effects. It still is a huge, huge supplier of employment in this region in the map that we see on the lower left. Okay, that'll do it. So again, here were the questions that hopefully this video shed light on. And that's it. More on the second New Deal when we come back. Thank you so much.